Before the first stone was lifted, before the first empire drew its borders on a map, there was a silence that haunted humanity, the silence of empty vessels, dry throats, cracked earth. Cities paused at the edge of survival, listening for the sound of water that never came. Civilizations did not rise because of power or wealth. They rose because water agreed to stay. And when it refused, everything else collapsed. Welcome to this journey through time, where history flows not through ink and parchment, but through stone channels and quiet gradients. We're glad you're here with us. If stories that blend engineering, history, and human ingenuity speak to you, we warmly invite you to subscribe and continue exploring the ancient world together. Long before aqueducts became monuments, water was destiny. Early humans followed rivers like pilgrims, building homes where floods nourished soil and fish filled nets. But rivers were fickle companions. They flooded without mercy and vanished without warning. As populations grew, dependence turned into desperation. Wells ran dry, springs failed. Carrying water consumed entire days, shaping lives around a single, exhausting task. In this struggle, the question was not how to conquer nature, but how to cooperate with it. The first idea was simple, almost fragile in its ambition. What if water could be persuaded to come to us? Not dragged, not forced, but guided. Gravity was always present, always patient. Humans only needed to understand its language. From this realization emerged the earliest channels, shallow trenches lined with clay or stone, nudging water downhill with barely noticeable slopes. These were the ancestors of aqueducts, humble and often invisible, yet revolutionary. What made aqueducts extraordinary was not their size, but their restraint. They demanded discipline. A single miscalculation could doom an entire settlement. Too steep, and water would erode its own path, destroying years of labor. Too shallow, and it would stagnate, turning life-giving flow into sickness. Early builders learned through failure, observing how water behaved in nature, how it curved around rocks, slowed in valleys, quickened on slopes. Engineering was born not in workshops, but in watching streams. As villages became towns and towns aspired to become cities, the challenge intensified. Water sources lay farther away, often separated by hills and ravines. Carrying water by hand no longer scaled with ambition. Leaders began to understand something profound. Infrastructure was power. Not the visible power of armies, but the invisible power of reliability. A city with steady water could grow, specialize, and endure. One without it would wither, no matter how strong its walls. Aqueducts changed the relationship between humans and landscape. Instead of settling only where water already flowed, people began reshaping terrain with careful precision. Surveying emerged as a craft, blending geometry with intuition. Builders learned to read the land, tracing paths that followed contours like invisible rivers in the air. Every curve mattered. Every stone placed carried the weight of future generations. Water, once sacred because it was scarce, became sacred because it was shared. The earliest aqueduct-fed communities discovered a subtle transformation in daily life. Time freed from water collection could be spent farming better, building stronger homes, teaching children, or imagining new ideas. Clean water meant fewer illnesses, stronger bodies, longer lives. Without realizing it, these societies laid the groundwork for urban civilization. Yet, aqueducts were never merely technical solutions. They reflected values. Choosing to build one meant believing in tomorrow. It meant committing resources to something that would not reward its builders immediately, but would sustain countless others long after their names were forgotten. In this sense, aqueducts were acts of optimism carved into earth and stone. Chapter 1 of this story is not about Rome, arches, or grandeur. It is about thirst, patience, and a quiet agreement between humans and gravity. It is about the moment humanity stopped chasing water and instead learned how to invite it home. From that moment onward, history did not just move forward, it flowed. Rome did not invent the aqueduct, but it understood it better than anyone before. Where earlier civilizations saw water channels as fragile lifelines, Rome saw a system, something that could be standardized, expanded, and trusted to serve millions. The Roman aqueduct was not an experiment, it was a declaration that engineering could be as reliable as law, as enduring as stone. As the city of Rome swelled beyond the banks of the Tiber, its thirst grew unbearable. Wells and cisterns could no longer support a population marching toward 1 million souls. The solution lay far beyond the city walls, in distant springs hidden among hills and forests. Roman engineers did not look at the distance with fear, they measured it. Step by step, they surveyed the land with astonishing precision, mapping paths so subtle that the water itself would never realize how far it had traveled. The genius of Roman aqueducts rested in their mastery of gradient. Over tens of kilometers, the drop could be no more than a few meters. This demanded an understanding of geometry so refined that modern engineers still marvel at it. Using simple tools, acrobates filled with water to detect level, plumb lines swaying in the wind, siding rods aligned with the horizon, they achieved accuracy that tolerated no arrogance. Nature was not corrected, it was followed. Most Roman aqueducts were hidden. Contrary to popular imagination, the soaring stone arches were rare moments of necessity, not displays of vanity. Underground channels protected water from contamination, evaporation, and sabotage. Covered with stone slabs, these tunnels maintained a steady temperature, ensuring consistent flow. When valleys interrupted the path, arches rose not to impress, but to preserve the slope. Each arch was a mathematical compromise between gravity and terrain. Materials mattered deeply. Stone alone could crack, brick alone could weaken. Roman concrete, poured wet and hardened into near eternity, bound everything together. Inside the channels, waterproof mortar smoothed surfaces, reducing friction and preventing leaks. Even mineral buildup, an unavoidable consequence of flowing water, was anticipated. Maintenance shafts were placed at intervals, allowing workers to descend, scrape deposits, and restore the channel's breadth. When the water finally reached the city, it did not rush chaotically into homes. It entered distribution tanks, castella, where flow was carefully divided. Public fountains were fed first because survival was communal before it was private. Baths received generous supplies, not merely for hygiene but for social order. In Rome, cleanliness was not a luxury, it was a civic expectation. Excess water flushed latrines and sewers, carrying waste away from living spaces, turning water into a silent guardian of public health. Aqueducts reshaped Roman life in ways that were impossible to ignore. The sound of running water echoed through streets and courtyards. Fountains became landmarks, meeting places, symbols of stability. Farmers beyond the city walls diverted overflow to irrigate fields, tying urban growth directly to rural prosperity. Water unified the empire's heartbeat, flowing from mountain springs into marble basins with unbroken continuity. Yet this brilliance required vigilance. An aqueduct neglected was an aqueduct doomed. Cracks widened, plants invaded joints, sediments slowed flow. Rome responded with bureaucracy. Water commissioners were appointed, laws protected channels from damage. Even private tapping was regulated because water theft threatened the balance of the entire system. In Rome, engineering and governance were inseparable. The Roman aqueduct was more than stone and water. It was philosophy made physical. It taught that power could be quiet, that endurance came from precision, and that the greatest achievements were those that worked so flawlessly they faded into the background of daily life. Rome's armies conquered territories, but its aqueducts conquered time. By trusting gravity instead of fighting it, Rome unlocked a future where cities could grow without choking on their own ambition. Water flowed, the city breathed, and an empire learned that true dominance was not in spectacle, but in systems that never failed, until the people who remembered how to care for them were gone. As the Roman aqueducts stretched across continents, they gave the illusion that such mastery belonged to Rome alone. But water has always taught the same lesson to every civilization willing to listen. Across deserts, jungles, mountains, and plateaus, human societies, separated by oceans and centuries, arrived at remarkably similar answers. Different stones, different rituals, different gods, yet the same quiet understanding. Water must be guided with respect, not urgency. In the arid lands of Persia, where rivers were rare and rain was a rumor, engineers turned their attention underground. Qanats were born not from abundance, but from restraint. These gently sloping tunnels tapped into distant aquifers and carried cool water for kilometers beneath the desert surface. Vertical shafts punctured the land at intervals, allowing light, air, and access for maintenance. From above, the earth appeared scarred with a line of holes. Below, a hidden river flowed in darkness, protected from evaporation and enemy eyes alike. Qanats demanded extraordinary foresight. A single misjudgment in slope could doom years of labor. Builders learned to read the color of soil, the taste of moisture, the subtle temperature of stone. Communities formed around these underground lifelines, sharing responsibility for upkeep, because neglect meant collective death. Water distribution followed tradition and law, measured not by pipes, but by time. Each household allotted hours of flow, teaching discipline through necessity. Far to the east, in the Indian subcontinent, water architecture took on a different soul. Stepwells descended into the earth like inverted temples, their geometric staircases guiding people toward water that rose and fell with the seasons. These were not merely reservoirs, they were social and spiritual spaces. Carved stone columns reflected in still water, while travelers rested in the cool shade below ground. Engineering here embraced beauty, understanding that reverence encouraged care. In mountainous regions, where water fell fast and fierce, civilizations learned to slow it down. The Inca carved channels directly into living rock, following slopes so precise they appear almost organic. Water flowed beside agricultural terraces, nourishing crops at exact intervals before returning to the land. There was no separation between engineering and environment. The mountains were not obstacles, they were collaborators. Even in the ancient Americas, where metal tools were scarce, water management flourished. The Maya redirected streams through limestone channels, feeding reservoirs that sustained cities during long dry seasons. Every decision accounted for climate unpredictability. Storage was as important as flow. Survival depended not on dominating water, but on anticipating its absence. What unites these systems is not technology, but philosophy. None relied on pressure or force. There were no pumps, no engines, no frantic acceleration. Gravity did all the work, patiently, endlessly. These civilizations trusted slow solutions for long futures. Water moved at walking speed, sometimes slower, because haste introduced chaos. Cultural beliefs shaped design. In some regions, water was sacred and untouchable, flowing through ceremonial spaces before reaching the people. In others, it was communal property, regulated by elders and tradition. Yet everywhere, water infrastructure reflected collective values. Aqueducts, qanats, channels, and wells were mirrors of society's priorities: cooperation over competition, continuity over conquest. What is most striking is how often these systems endured longer than the civilizations that built them. Empires collapsed, languages vanished, borders dissolved, yet water continued to flow through ancient paths. Some qanats still function today. Stepwells still collect monsoon rain. Inca channels still guide mountain streams. These are not ruins, they are conversations across time. Chapter 3 reveals a truth often overlooked. Innovation is not a straight line. It is a constellation of parallel insights, born wherever humans paused long enough to observe water and learn from it. The aqueduct was never a single invention. It was a shared realization, rediscovered again and again, that survival depends not on how much water you have, but on how wisely you guide it. When water learned how to arrive on its own, life itself began to change its rhythm. Aqueducts did more than fill basins and fountains. They quietly rewrote the daily habits of millions. With a steady flow assured, cities no longer woke each morning to the urgency of survival. Instead, they awoke to possibility. The presence of water, constant and dependable, reshaped how people lived, worked, gathered, and even how they understood cleanliness and comfort. In cities fed by aqueducts, the burden of carrying water vanished for most of the population. Time, once spent hauling heavy jars through narrow streets, returned to human hands. Artisans refined their crafts, merchants expanded their trade, teachers and philosophers found audiences unexhausted by basic survival. This invisible gift of time may have been the aqueduct's greatest contribution, quietly fueling cultural and intellectual growth. Public fountains became the heartbeat of neighborhoods. They were more than utility points, they were social anchors. People met there, exchanged news, argued politics, arranged marriages. Flowing water meant constant movement, and constant movement meant connection. In these shared spaces, the idea of community deepened, reinforced daily by the simple act of drawing water from a common source. Baths transformed the relationship between the body and society. In places like Rome, bathing was not a private act but a civic ritual. Aqueducts made it possible for vast complexes to operate daily, heating, circulating, and draining enormous volumes of water. Cleanliness became routine rather than rare. Disease did not vanish, but its grip loosened. Water flushed waste away, carrying it out of living spaces and into engineered drains, turning sanitation into an unseen ally. Agriculture felt the change as well. Overflow from aqueducts irrigated fields beyond city walls, stabilizing food supplies and reducing dependence on unpredictable rainfall. Farmers could plan seasons with greater confidence. Crops diversified. Urban and rural lives became intertwined through shared water systems, blurring the line between city and countryside. Social order was also shaped by water's path. In many cities, public access was prioritized over private luxury. This choice was not accidental. It reinforced the idea that survival resources belonged to the collective. Where water flowed first revealed who mattered most. In times of scarcity, these systems exposed inequality just as clearly as they sustained life. Aqueducts became moral infrastructure as much as physical ones. Children grew up with water as a constant presence. They heard it flowing through channels, splashing into basins, echoing beneath streets. To them, abundance felt natural. They could not imagine a world where water was hunted rather than received. In this way, aqueducts reshaped memory itself, creating generations who assumed stability where once there had been fear. Yet, dependence carried risk. When water stopped flowing, panic followed. A broken channel or neglected maintenance could unravel daily life with shocking speed. Markets stalled, baths closed, disease returned. These moments reminded cities that engineering was not magic, it required care, labor, and respect. Aqueducts demanded stewardship, binding communities to long-term responsibility. Chapter 4 is the story of what happens when survival becomes reliable. Aqueducts did not merely support life, they elevated it. They allowed humans to think beyond the next sunrise, to invest in beauty, knowledge, and connection. Water flowing through stone channels flowed equally through society itself, shaping habits, values, and expectations. In learning to guide water, humanity learned how to build cities that were not just larger, but more human. There comes a moment in every great system's life when the flow begins to falter. Not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, like water thinning before it disappears into sand. For the aqueducts of the ancient world, decline did not arrive as a single collapse, it arrived as forgetfulness, as maintenance was delayed, as knowledge passed on orally failed to reach the next generation. Stone endured, but understanding did not always follow. When empires fractured, aqueducts suffered first not from destruction, but from neglect. Skilled engineers were no longer trained. Administrators who once monitored gradients and repairs vanished. Small cracks widened, mineral deposits hardened, roots pushed apart carefully fitted stones. Water slowed, then stopped. Cities that had grown confident in abundance found themselves vulnerable again, forced back toward rivers and wells as if history were reversing its course. In some places, aqueducts were deliberately dismantled. Stone was reused for fortifications, homes, and churches. What had once carried life was repurposed to defend it. Yet even in ruin, the aqueducts refused to disappear completely. Their arches remained etched into landscapes, haunting reminders of a time when patience and precision governed construction. They became silent teachers waiting for curious minds to ask how they worked. Centuries later, those questions returned. Renaissance engineers measured ancient channels, tracing their slopes, marveling at their subtlety. They discovered that sophistication did not require machines, only understanding. Modern water systems, pipelines, sewers, reservoirs owe their logic to these ancient lessons. Flow, when respected, outlasts force. Today, as cities expand faster than ever before, aqueducts speak again with renewed relevance. Water scarcity, climate instability, and growing populations echo the challenges of the ancient world. The solutions, however, are not entirely new. Sustainable design, passive systems, long-term thinking, these are ideas written in stone thousands of years ago. The past does not demand imitation, only attention. Some ancient water systems still function, quietly defying time. Qanats continue to cool deserts. Stepwells still gather rain. Roman channels still carry mountain springs to modern towns. These are not relics, they are proofs of concept. They remind us that durability is not about overbuilding, but about building with humility toward nature's rules. The story of aqueducts ultimately circles back to the beginning. Water still determines where cities rise and fall. Technology may change, but dependence does not. What ancient engineers understood, and what modern society sometimes forgets, is that infrastructure is a promise to the future. It must be maintained, protected, and respected, or it will abandon us without warning. As the last stones weather and the last channels dry, the idea of the aqueduct endures. It lives in every pipe hidden beneath streets, every reservoir perched above a city, every system designed to work quietly rather than impress loudly. The water still flows because someone, long ago, chose patience over haste and wisdom over spectacle. And so this story ends not with collapse, but with continuity. The aqueduct was never just a structure, it was a philosophy, one that teaches us that the greatest achievements are those that serve endlessly, ask for little recognition, and remind humanity that progress, like water, moves best when guided gently, steadily, and with respect for the path ahead.